Thank you. Now we'll hear from John Chisholm, who has 3 decades of experience as an entrepreneur, a CEO, and as an investor.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por recibirme tan amablemente. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí. For the last 30 years, I have been privileged to live and work in what I think is one of the most exciting places in the world, namely Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. In that time, I worked for large companies like Hewlett-Packard and Xerox, many startups, and grown and sold 2 of my own companies. Silicon Valley has grown rapidly during those 3 decades. It's expanding and evolving from semiconductors to computers to software to biotech to internet to mobile devices and applications. Today, it's home to such familiar names as Apple, Google, Facebook, HP, Intel, Genentech, Salesforce. I could go on and on. So I've had an opportunity to observe firsthand what makes for a business environment that supports entrepreneurship and attracts skilled professionals from around the world, and to give some thought about which of those factors might be applicable to the EU. First to understand is that Silicon Valley has arisen organically over the last 50 years since HP spun out of Stanford in the 1930s. Silicon Valley was not designed or planned, nor could it have been designed or planned. The culture of Silicon Valley, as I will explain, is unique, and even within the U.S. Also, you cannot tell a priori who the winners or losers will be. Any centralized top-down approach of trying to pick winners or losers is likely to fail, in my view. So while the EU's interest in creating entrepreneurial enclaves across Europe is laudable, and investing in new companies that appear to be winners might create some small successes, overall, I would not be very bullish on that approach. Let me first talk about what I see is unique about Silicon Valley that's contributed to its success, then talk about what has negatively impacted the growth of Silicon Valley, in my view, then discuss which of these factors apply and do not apply in the EU and Spain as I see it, and then finally, what might be some suggestions for EU and Spain. First, the San Francisco Bay Area is blessed with 2 world-class technical universities, Stanford in Palo Alto and Berkeley in the East Bay. Many of our high-tech companies, either directly or indirectly, have spun out of one of these 2 universities. Of course, Boston, Massachusetts also has 2 world-class universities, namely Harvard and my alma mater, MIT. And indeed, Boston has its own smaller version of Silicon Valley known as Route 128. But even though Route 128 got started much earlier than Silicon Valley, with companies like Raytheon and Arthur D. Little and Honeywell, Silicon Valley rapidly overtook it. Why is that? Well, Berkeley professor Annalise Saxenian wrote an excellent book to answer these questions in the 1990s called Regional Advantage, Silicon Valley versus Route 128. And she cited many reasons that Silicon Valley overtook Route 128. First, while Route 128 was mainly populated with highly vertically integrated companies like Honeywell, Digital Equipment, Wang and Prime, computer companies that made everything, disk drives, controllers, operating systems, terminals, and CPUs, Silicon Valley companies were much more atomic. You had separate companies specializing in disk drives and terminals and operating software and microprocessors and disk controllers. Computer companies in Silicon Valley tended to use many more off-the-shelf parts like Intel microprocessors or license the Unix operating system from Berkeley. So the competition was more direct at a smaller scale and more intense. Most of Boston's computer companies, including Digital Equipment, Prime, and Wang, have long disappeared, while Silicon Valley's Apple is going gangbusters and HP is still hanging in there. Second, besides the more granular structure of its industries, Silicon Valley is also culturally different from Route 128. Dress codes are more casual and working hours are more flexible. Most importantly, job hopping among and between both large and small companies is much more culturally accepted in Silicon Valley than Route 128. This job hopping spreads knowledge and ideas from company to company, which fosters innovation. In contrast, around Route 128, lifelong employment was much more the norm, and job hopping was much more met with suspicion. Two new trends are further extending the spread of knowledge and ideas today: incubators and co-housing. Incubators are office buildings housing anywhere from half a dozen to 100 startups under one roof. These companies deal with many of the same challenges, for example, understanding how best to program in Python or for Android, and software developers freely share technical knowledge with each other. It's a great way to learn as you go. In the last decade, Silicon Valley has expanded from the mid-peninsula of San Francisco, from Palo Alto and south, all the way north to south of Market, or SoMa, which is part of San Francisco. San Francisco is the new trend leader for the entire area, in my view, and one of the newest other trends there is called co-housing. In co-housing, you have anywhere from 4 to 20 young people, budding entrepreneurs, all working and living together working together on their different companies, all under the same roof. Each company might have anywhere from 1 to half a dozen employees. Typically, co-housing arrangements have the computers and desks downstairs and the sleeping arrangements upstairs. So it's not just working together, but working and living together. Often the sleeping arrangements are very casual, with guys and gals sharing the same room or more. As you can imagine, living and working together with other entrepreneurs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, hugely accelerates learning and the spread of ideas and knowledge. The third factor I would mention, after industry structure and culture, is a combination of the acceptance of failure and a history of successes, which both attract capable and ambitious people to the region and provides capital, both venture capital and angel capital, for investment. Regarding failure, people understand that failure is often the fastest way to learn, and that the probability of having one or more failures before your first success is very high. Having worked for at least one failed startup is so common that it is just no big deal. And regarding successes, everyone's heard of the huge IPOs like Google and Facebook, but realize that for every very visible liquidity event like those, are thousands of much smaller liquidity events that spread wealth very broadly across the region. This has given rise to both a vibrant venture capital industry and tens of thousands of smaller scale angel investors like me who help new companies get off the ground through small scale funding. So those are the factors contributing to entrepreneurial success, in my view. The biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship, both in Silicon Valley and for that matter anywhere, I think, is regulation. In most respects, starting a new company has become easier. In the last 2 decades, software has become more functional and smarter. Many small business services are now available, many of them free online, and customers for niche products are easier to find and serve. Entrepreneurs generally need less funding today to get started and can more easily identify and qualify funding sources. You can outsource entire departments. Skills can be learned for free through online courses. All of these things have made starting businesses easier. But one thing has made starting businesses harder, and that is government regulation. Let me give you one small example. Satisfying the U.S. Internal Revenue Service that a contractor is a contractor and not an employee often requires a tax specialist or attorney, or having another firm hire the contractor as an employee and contract that person to you, a significant management burden and expense in any case. I'm sure there are very similar regulations that apply in the EU. And many other regulations burden entrepreneurs besides worker status in the U.S. IRS tax liens, minimum wages, equal opportunity, Americans with Disabilities Act, occupational safe and health. I could go on and on. Added to these are a myriad state, local, and industry-specific regulations. Here's a soundbite for anyone who is tweeting. A simple law is not necessarily good, but a complex law or multiple layers of law is almost certainly bad. So these are some of the factors which, in my view, contribute to and detract from Silicon Valley's success. Now, which of these apply to the EU and Spain? I don't see in the EU or Spain a highly atomic industry ecosystem. I don't see the culture of job hopping and acceptance of failure. And I don't see the history of entrepreneurial success. I do see a rapidly growing regulatory environment. So what can EU and Spain do? Creating a vibrant entrepreneurial economic ecosystem takes not years, but decades. Bureaucrats may think that it's like growing crops on a farm to create entrepreneurship, but no, it's much more akin to growing a dense, profuse jungle. Unlike uniform farmland that might grow predictably, a jungle has no design at all except the right climate and environment. So here are some specific suggestions to create that climate and environment. One is to provide for and enforce property rights, contracts, and the rule of law. If investors and executives have no confidence that their investments will be protected and their companies' agreements with other companies will be enforced, they will not start companies here. It takes time to build up this history to assure investors and companies that their property rights, contracts, and rule of law are real. So even though there may not be any payoff for several years, maybe a decade, it's essential for companies in the EU to begin putting in place these policies and disciplines today. Second, create a tax structure that enables successful entrepreneurs here to keep more of their gains from the acquisition or public offering of their companies than other European countries, or ideally, more of the gains than they could keep anywhere in the world. It's not sufficient for a company to be more attractive today than they were yesterday, a country. They have to be significantly more attractive than other countries in the EU and around the world. Look at how much growth Dubai has enjoyed in the last few decades. There are no personal taxes there. I recently invested in a high-tech company, Fido Labs, a leader in natural language processing, that moved its headquarters to the U.S. from Gdansk, Poland. Moving companies across borders is getting easier every year. If Poland wants to keep such companies in Poland, they will increasingly have to create a more attractive tax and regulatory environment than not just other countries in the EU, but other countries around the world, including the U.S. 3, create a business environment as lightly regulated as possible. We cannot predict very far ahead along which dimensions and in which directions technology will evolve. Regulations enacted today block innovations in dimensions we can't even see yet, and they're cumulative, the regulations are, raising more and more obstacles to innovation. Regulations further force businesses to use precious capital for regulatory compliance. We forget that markets are already naturally regulated by such laws as supply and demand and word of mouth. Imposing top-down regulations on top of these natural regulations creates a legal morass of uncertainty and cost, and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few who can afford the best legal advice and financial advice, are suitably connected, or sufficiently influential to seek and win favorable interpretations and exemptions. Beyond this, regulators and politicians, of course, have their own agendas, like rewarding those who support them and staying in power, that don't align with the interests of the public. These factors, public choice and agency issues, still further divert precious capital from its most productive applications. For both regulations and taxes, a good metric that any country might measure itself against is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. This ranking is a composite of 10 factors, such as the ease of starting a business, registering property, getting construction permits, enforcing contracts, and trading across borders. Here's a challenge to Spain. Consider a very specific goal, like cutting Spain's rank in half in 5 years by 2019. I often hear ambassadors and economic ministers talk about how they are creating startup incubators or providing tax breaks to startups in their countries. I call these measures entrepreneurship theater, window dressing, Potemkin villages. Such superficial measures make officials look good and the public feel good, but they will not accomplish significant long-term good. For true long-term growth and improvements in the quality of life that only the formation and growth of many companies will drive, focus on the really hard foundational issues: protecting private property, enforcing contracts, creating attractive tax environments, and eliminating regulation. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, John.